Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more of our virtual conversations. Everyone is understandably preoccupied with the news about coronavirus these days, but some of us have lost sight of the fact that we have a national election in November. Who's in? Who's out? Will Trump be reelected? Will the Senate flip for the Democrats? Will the Democrats hold the House? Here to help us answer some of these questions is our resident pollster and political analyst, Doug Schoen, who has been calling elections for us for the past decade with uncanny accuracy. We're pleased to welcome Doug Schoen back to this program. Now, the first question is, we talk about people being ahead in the polls, behind in the polls. What polls are we talking about? And are they reliable? And why did they miss it in 2016 when they called the election for Hillary Clinton?
Well, there are a number of questions there, and I'll take them as you offered them. First, a poll now, whether it be public or private, is not a predictor of the election. The bulk of the polls I've seen, Jim, show Joe Biden slightly ahead, 3 to 6 points ahead in the swing states. But polls can change, and I think this election will go down to the wire, and I think it will be a very close election. So I don't think that the public polls, however accurate they may appear to be now, can be considered predictive of the final result. In 2016, Jim, Hillary Clinton had a narrow lead in the national polls going into Election Day. That lead did not evaporate nationally, but in the swing states did evaporate, so that the swing states became closer. So the polling, which was widely derided for being inaccurate, was actually a little bit better than most people give it credit for being. In fact, most people couldn't accept the notion that Donald Trump might win the election. And given that Trump did in fact win, people were startled that polls in swing states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and the like were within a 0.5%. Well, Trump won. He basically drew to an inside straight, but those polls were tightening as Election Day approached.
In general, Doug, are statewide polls more accurate than national polls?
Actually, I think national polls tend to be more accurate because you have a bigger country, typically a bigger sample, and they're less responsive or to individual geographical or ethnic differences that you find in state polling. So I found the smaller the jurisdiction, the tougher it is to, in fact, get it right in terms of polls.
How vulnerable is Trump, according to your sense of the body politic?
Well, I've seen lots of polls, and obviously I think about this a lot, and I think he's quite vulnerable. I think his response to coronavirus has been about 20 points below what the average governor is getting in ratings. And I think there is a sense that Trump, however good a president he was or was not until the middle of March, has been, in a certain sense, without a strategy on coronavirus.
Would you say that pre-coronavirus, say January, February, Trump probably would have stood a great chance of reelection? Is that a fair statement?
I think it was. I think with the economy in as good shape as it was, the Democrats divided. Biden is obviously not an ideal nominee. I made Trump a narrow favorite then. Now I'd make Biden a narrow favorite just because the economy's in bad shape. We're heading to 30% unemployment, and coronavirus remains a problem with the tragic possibility, maybe even more than a possibility, that we'll hit 100,000 deaths sometime soon.
So just to review some figures, last February, GDP was up 2.1% in the fourth quarter of last year. Now it's down 4.8% in the first quarter. The Dow in February was at 29,500, capping the largest bull market in history. Today, it is at 25,000, a decline of about 18%. And we had a problem with the trade war with China, and it appeared to have been resolved, at least with an initial agreement. Now our relationship with China seems to be in tatters. Has all this affected the outcome in the minds of voters?
Oh, absolutely. Look, if people aren't working, they typically vote against the incumbent. Elections, ultimately, no matter what's going on, are referenda on the economy. That being said, I also believe that Trump's lack of a clear plan to deal with coronavirus and some of his misstatements have hurt him with a populace that, while it may not be 100% committed to social distancing and stay at home orders, is certainly more committed to that approach than he and indeed some of his more militant supporters.
Let's talk for a moment about approval rating. His approval rating is at 43%. It's averaged around 40% where it's hovered. And if you look at the one-term presidents in our lifetime, Ford, with a 47.2% approval rating, failed of re-election or election. He was appointed originally. Carter failed of re-election with a 45% approval rating. Is it possible to be elected president of the United States with a 40% approval rating?
At 40% no, 43% unlikely, 45% a distant possibility, 47, 48, you're getting in the range. And my hypothesis is, Jim, that when some of the Republicans who are disappointed with Trump's performance now, for whatever reason, the economy, coronavirus, get into the election, they'll come back to the Republican Party. I don't see them voting for Biden. And ultimately, I think Trump's numbers will inch up, largely from Republicans and independents. And that's why I'm projecting a very close election again.
Now, you also have 60% of the country who think that we're on the wrong track. I mean, these are damning figures in terms of the Trump presidency.
You know, that is certainly true. And that's one of the reasons, Jim, why I make Biden a favorite at this point. But given what Trump is going to do to Biden, and I think he's starting now, there is going to be a very, very vicious and I think well-funded negative campaign against the former vice president. And I expect that his own ratings will go down commensurately.
One of your colleagues has recently said, perhaps with tongue in cheek, that this election is not about issues. This election is about whether you loathe Donald Trump or you love Donald Trump. And there's no other issue in the campaign. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that's part of it. I think people who don't like Trump aren't going to vote for him, and those who do will. But there are people in the middle, the so-called swing voters, maybe 20% of the electorate, Jim, who will make a decision based on performance. Do they think the country's back on the right track? Is the economy reviving? Are we doing a better job to deal with coronavirus? Is there a second wave that is hopefully not deadly? Those will be the questions, and I think we won't really answer them until September. The analogy I use, Jim, is the 1980 election, when the economy was in bad shape and we had the hostage crisis. And in the last week of the election, people decided Ronald Reagan was okay and Jimmy Carter wasn't. I suspect we will have that kind of a reckoning in the final week or 10 days of the November 2020 election.
Well, when you say swing voters, Doug, do you mean swing voters in general or swing voters in the 6 battleground states where I think most people agree the election will be won or lost?
I really should have been more precise and said swing voters in swing states. Literally, this is an election like the last one, Jim, where the vote will turn on, and I say this with a smile on my face, how about 15 to 20% of the electorate in 6 states decides to vote. And it could be the swing of 10, 15% of those swing voters, or really a few million people or less that could determine how this election turns out.
Well, the swing states, lest anybody forget, which all went for Trump in 2016, are Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. And according to the polls I've seen, Biden is ahead in some states like Arizona quite decisively and impressively, and some quite closely in 5 of the 6 swing states. Only in North Carolina is it probably too close to call, and probably Trump can pull it out. So if those figures hold, Biden is the next president.
Yeah, the big if in what you said is if they hold. And at this point, I would, as I said, make him the favorite. But the margin, I think the biggest one, if I'm correct, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, was like Arizona at 7, Florida is 4, a number of the other swing states are somewhere 3 to 5 or 6. Those are all pretty close, Jim, to the margin of error. So I'm not ready at this point to count Trump out. But for the reasons you cite in terms of his approval rating, the country off on the wrong track, surely at this point, he's an underdog. And the one who knows that the best is Donald J. Trump.
Yes. Well, in 3 of the 6 states, there is a large senior population, where you are in Florida and Arizona and perhaps Pennsylvania. And there seems to be reporting that seniors, because of the coronavirus and his handling of the coronavirus, have lost all confidence in Donald Trump. How do you deal with that?
Well, that becomes a problem. I think I saw numbers out of Florida. You'll, again, correct me if I'm wrong, that had Trump down 52-42 with seniors. And that is a problem for 2 reasons. One, they are reliable voters. But second, they are the ones that are going to be most impacted, given their risk profile, by coronavirus and most likely to vote on it. And Trump's performance, I think, at best, would be called uneven.
Now, Biden will, at the conclusion of the term, if he's elected, will be 80. And it's unlikely that he'll be a 2-term president if he's elected. And people will focus heavily on the vice president, who, assuming Biden survives for 4 years, will likely be the next president, or could be. How important is his choice of vice president, or doesn't that really figure very much with voters?
Oh, I think it does. And I think there are competing demands. First, given the role that African Americans played in nominating him, Jim, I think that there is a very real likelihood that someone like Kamala Harris will remain and be in contention at the top of the list. I think the African American vote almost single-handedly delivered the nomination to Biden, given the vote in South Carolina and then on Super Tuesday. At the same time, there's the possibility that Biden goes for one of the 2 or 3 qualified Hispanic American candidates, one of the governors of New Mexico, senator from Nevada. That's certainly a possibility. And there is also the chance, given the emphasis on swing states that you mentioned earlier, that somebody like Amy Klobuchar would be a very, very good running mate, who presumably would be seen as somebody who was well qualified to govern, should Biden not be able, for whatever reason, to continue. There are competing demands. How will the African Americans feel if Klobuchar is nominated and a qualified African American, whether it be Kamala Harris, Val Demings, or somebody else, is kept off the ballot? Those are questions we need to answer.
What is your thought about the dark horses? You mentioned Val Jennings. How about Gina Raimondo?
Again, I think Gina Raimondo would be a very good candidate, but she is somebody who has pursued pretty fiscally conservative remedies to the budget deficit in Rhode Island. I think some tax increases, some pension reductions, and I think she'd be a great vice president, maybe even a great president. I'm not sure, given the issues with Rhode Island, and Rhode Island is exactly not particularly influential in swing states, I'm not sure she would be at the top of my list.
Val Jennings?
Again, she's been a sheriff, law enforcement, Florida, but there are questions with her about whether she had been a little too tough when she was a sheriff, and whether she is in keeping with the movement in the Democratic Party towards decriminalization.
So to push you, who do you think he's going to choose?
If I had to pick, I'd pick Kamala Harris, Jim.
You think Kamala Harris?
I
Well,
think
she also has a record on law enforcement.
she does,
Uh,
and that's fair. I just think she is the highest ranking African American senator, and she's also qualified by conventional standards, and I think it's the path of least resistance. But certainly, he could go in another direction.
Women. There's this flap about Tara Reid. Has that hurt Biden a great deal?
With more that comes out about Tara Reid, Jim, the more questions I think people have about her resume, what happened or didn't happen. And we saw with Trump in 2016 that the whole issue of these alleged assignations did not impact him. I tend to think Tara Reid will not be a factor in the November election.
And what do you think Biden's standing is with women, particularly if he chooses, he's committed to choosing a female vice president nominee?
I think by election day, there'll be a huge gender gap. And my guess is that women, if Joe Biden wins, will be one of the large reasons why that will happen.
So one of the questions I'm frequently asked is Trump's business history and his history with women. How did he get away with it all these years? And how does he get away with his record of lies and misstatements? I mean, where do his strengths lie among the voters? Are they prepared to swallow it all?
You know, those are good questions, and I would urge the audience to review your book on Trump and his legal problems for definitive answers to the questions you raised. That being said, I think what's happened is people were so angry in 2016, didn't like Hillary. They saw Trump as a verifiable outsider, and as an outsider, they decided to vote against him. I vote against Hillary, vote against the incumbent Barack Obama, and Hillary as the continuation, presumably, of those policies.
So those factors should cut against Trump this year.
I think they probably do. I would say this: he is one of the great campaigners I've ever seen, and he is never held back by his tendency to obfuscate and prevaricate.
Obfuscate and prevaricate. Now, in the Democratic primary debates, foreign affairs played a very small role, maybe 10 to 15% of the dialogue. Is foreign affairs going to be a big issue in the campaign? Trump's handling of North Korea and Iran and his withdrawal from the world, and also Israel. I don't know which way that cuts, pro-Trump or anti-Trump, but his seeming endorsement of the Israeli intention to annex portions of the West Bank.
Well, I'll give you what I think is the way foreign policy will play out, which is something you didn't mention, which is China. I think Trump is going to make the case that he's been tough on the Chinese. He has put additional sanctions, and that he shut off air travel as soon as he saw the problems in Wuhan and the associated laboratory. That will be his argument. I think the Democrats will say he was asleep at the switch and that his foreign policy has been bad. But I think the election in terms of foreign policy will largely turn on China.
Well, Trump has attempted to identify Biden with China, calls him Beijing Joe, and say that to make the case that he's been soft on China over the years, and also to blame China for the virus, which may be a stretch, but appeal to people's xenophobia. I mean, is that going to make an impression with the voters?
Well, I think he wants to neutralize the issue at the very least and show that he's been tough, whatever that means. So will it make a difference? I think that's one of the unanswered questions of this election, Jim, how that plays out. Right now, people principally blame China for coronavirus, though at this point, they give the edge narrowly to Biden in terms of who can handle the issue better.
Okay, let's turn to the Senate,
Yeah.
where the Democrats need 3 seats to flip the Senate.
Mhm.
There are a number of Senate races which we're all watching very closely in Arizona, Maine, Montana, Kansas, other states. Mitch McConnell even is
Yep.
receiving a serious challenge. How do you feel the Senate is going to turn out?
I think the Senate's about 50-50, Jim, vis-a-vis flipping. There's one pickup that I think that the Republicans will get in Alabama. Likely they'll nominate Tommy Tuberville. Tommy Tuberville, a former football coach at Auburn, I think will be a strong candidate against Doug Jones. But at the same time, the states you mentioned, Arizona, I guess it was Montana, Kansas potentially, Maine, even Kentucky, I think they're all in play. The Democrats would need to win 3 or 4 of them, depending on who wins the presidency. And I rank that as a basically even proposition.
How about South Carolina? Lindsey Graham was falling into disrepute in South Carolina, being challenged by Jamie Harrison. Where do you see
Boy,
that?
I'd be surprised if South Carolina flips. Such a Republican state. And I know Harrison's raised a lot of money, good candidate.
How about North Carolina? Can Cal Cunningham unseat Tom Tillis, the incumbent?
It's a close race. North Carolina, as you pointed out in the presidential, is also close. My sense is that election will be a close one. I'd give Tillis, the incumbent, a very, very slight advantage.
And Georgia, David Perdue, the Republican incumbent, against John Ossoff.
Ossoff is polling pretty darn well now. I've seen polls that show him maybe a point or two ahead. Perdue, again, as an incumbent, I think is in strong shape.
Okay, what about Kansas? There's a vacancy created by the retirement of Pat Roberts. You have Barbara Bollier, a physician and popular state senator, challenging Chris Kobach, a Republican, who they say is very unpopular. Is
Right.
Kansas going to go for the Democrats?
Again, I worked in Roberts's last election 6 years ago against him. And boy, there was a strong Republican tide. Kobach is a bad candidate. If he's nominated, I'd give the Democrats maybe a 40-45% chance. But if Boulay wins, I'd make the Republicans clear favorites.
Okay. What about the House races? The Democrats took the House in 2018 with kitchen table issues, health care and income equality.
Yep.
And other similar traditionally Democratic issues. You think they're going to hold the House?
I bet that they do hold the House. My guess is that some of the seats that went Democratic in 2018 will flip back to the Republicans. But my guess is if the margin is over 40 now, it'll be somewhere in the mid-20s come election day. That would be what I'm seeing now. I don't see any great wave to the Democrats from the polling I've seen.
I have a question for you.
Please.
The first question is, what do you think is the major issue in 2020?
I think it is a combination of jobs and healthcare, and whether it's jobs or healthcare will be determined by, one, how many people remain unemployed, and second, how the path of the coronavirus takes us. But I think those are the two twin issues. And I think at this point, they're working to the Democrats' advantage.
Good. So if you were to call the election today, as you sit here, Doug Schoen, and I won't hold you to it because you're coming back for sure in October,
right?
And you'll have a chance to confess error, but I don't think you will. Number one, who's the next president of the United States?
Joe Biden.
Okay, and will the Republicans lose the Senate?
I think it'll be deadlocked, 50-50.
With Vice President Kamala Harris casting the deciding vote.
That's my prediction today.
Okay, and the House?
House, I think Democrats will have 25, 27 seat majority, a clear majority. So if I'm right, we will have a tight but clear working majority for the Democrats in the Senate, a bigger majority in the House, and a Democratic president. But until we get to October, Jim, I'm hedging my bets.
Okay, hedge your bets, and thank you for reading the tea leaves. And Doug Schoen, thank you for coming by, and thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations, virtual for sure next week. Perhaps in a month or two, we'll be back in the studio. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care, be safe, and all the best.